really kind of get into a world of my own. I approached the drums not as an instrument per se, but more an attitude of viciously attacking something. If I didn't play drums, I'd be in a lot of trouble.
Hey, welcome back to the channel. My name's Justin. Today we're taking a look at how Alex Van Halen used electronic and acoustic drums in his many drum sets over the years. They were huge, showy, weird, and even unnecessarily complex according to the man himself. And one really interesting aspect of the Van Halen sound stands out. That's his use of electronics. Let's go back and see where it all started. Alexander Arthur Van Halen was born in Amsterdam in 1953. The family moved to California when he was 9 years old and he became a US citizen. When they first arrived, Alex and Eddie couldn't even speak English for a while, and that might be why they developed a close bond with each other. So Alex didn't start off with drums as his main instrument. He picked up guitar and piano. Meanwhile, his brother Eddie bought a 4-piece St. George drum set. It cost him about $125 with money he earned while delivering newspapers. That seems like a killer deal today, but after you factor in inflation, it would be about $1,000 today.
I originally played guitar, and Ed played drums, and it was so obvious, so painfully obvious, as a matter of fact, that I couldn't cut it on guitar because we'd swap the instruments once in a while.
Once I found out that I was actually better at the guitar than on drums, and that Al was better on drums than guitar, it worked. It hit me like, oh God, he can play Wipeout and I can't.
Now the road to the band Van Halen is surprisingly odd.
I think when we played those first gigs as the Broken Combs, you know, and you see what kind of an effect you can have on people.
Who were the Broken Combs?
Oh, it was Ed and I and 3 other guys. So I was on saxophone. I know it sounds kind of shallow, but it's addicting to play in front of people that at the same time had that exchange between an audience and a performer.
That was switched over to the Trojan Rubber Company, which then got a name change to Genesis after they got a new bass player in Mark Stone. But then everybody realized that Genesis was taken up by another very famous band, so they switched over to Mammoth.
And when they got David Lee Roth as their singer, they made one last name change to Van Halen.
Alright, so now let's get into the gear. Alex became a full-time drummer when he was 18. So as you'd guess, he was churning through a lot of drum sets through his 6 decades of playing drums. Sometime around 1972, Alex started playing gigs with a double bass Ludwig drum set and a black diamond pearl wrap. And back then he wasn't using Paiste, he was actually using Zildjian cymbals. Moving forward a year to 1973 or possibly 1974, Alex put together his last normal-looking drum set he would play in a very, very long time. This was a double bass Ludwig classic set in a silver sparkle finish. I find it interesting that the kick drums don't really match. I think the one on the left is bigger by about 2 inches. No resonant drum heads for him back in the day, and the hi-hat stand was up as high as it would let him go.
The next big change came in 1977. The band signed with the Warner Brothers record label and began working on their first album.
Alex, can you tell us a little bit about how that developed?
By playing 5 hours a night, 5 days a week at different bars and clubs. We used to play about 5 hours of really hard, grinding rock and roll. No slow songs at all. And it just it carried on over to our original music.
Yeah, well, we were all going to different schools and living in generally the same area of California. None of us are from California. That's how come we don't sound like the Eagles. Yeah. The president of Warner Brothers came down and saw us playing in a bar one night. We were playing for free. And they said, we want to sign you.
They began opening for bands like Black Sabbath. And this is the beginning of Alex going nuts with his kick drums. This drum set had 4 bass drums bolted together, with chains draped over the middle, just because. He decided to stick with having kick drums in different dimensions. For the rest of the drum set, he was still sticking with Ludwig shells and a sparkle finish. You'll also notice the occasional fire extinguisher on the kick drum, for reasons. And at this point in his career, he decided to switch away from Zildjian over to Paiste 2002 cymbals and Sound Edge hi-hats. Now let's move ahead to 1979.
Does this tour feel a little bit different? You know, you are headlining?
It's different in the fact that we can do a longer show now. We can do all our material instead of just squeezing in 3 or 4 songs and then off the stage.
Last year it was, got a half an hour, guys, you know.
Go do it. Now we can do what we want to do and have a great time.
On the album Van Halen II, Alex was still using the previous drum set for the recording, but then he created a whole new drum set for the tour. And as you can tell, he had the tendency to choose drum sets that really stood out.
And this is when Alex started to include Tama octobans. This would become a huge part of his look in future setups.
And one thing that really surprises me about some of these early drum sets is the cymbal to drum ratio. He was also keeping those fire extinguishers on hand, you know, just in case the metal drums and metal cymbals caught on fire. But his stint with metal shells was pretty short-lived, because a year later he went back to maple shells. And he was not finished with his mission to create the strangest kick drums known to man. This time he used pieces of rubber tubing to combine 4 kick drums into 2, and now the iconic gong was now firmly in place behind the drum set. He continued to use Paiste 2002 cymbals, and the drum set featured a set of Pearl rototoms. As a quick side note, I almost saw this in person. I went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio to go check it out, but unfortunately, they removed it from the exhibit, and I don't know where it is now. So now let's move ahead to 1981.
Fair Warning was a rough time for the band in terms of
Kind of a dark record.
things that started to fall apart with Dave. As an outsider, I could see what Ed was going through. He spent a lot of time making that record.
Oh, no, I think every emotion, everything you feel, you know, depression, anger, everything comes out in the music.
Alex decided to make a pretty big change to his drum set once again, this time acrylic. Here's how Alex explained it. Well, in the past, I had a Visualite set by Ludwig. It had black and white stripes and was put together by gluing different strips together. One of the first things we do before anything, because Dave tends to jump on the drums and stand on them and humiliate them, is to test them for strength. I stood on the drum and it promptly snapped in half, so we took it to a place where they coated the inside with a 1/4 inch of fiberglass, and the sound on it was unreal. Now, one thing that I want to briefly touch on was the potential use of electronics on the song Push Comes to Shove from the album. His live setup didn't include any electronic drums, so this might have been something they did in the studio for the recording only. Or possibly it could have been a sound they triggered on a synth right on beat for the entire song by a keyboard player somewhere. And by the way, in a 1981 interview, Alex decided to talk crap about overly long drum solos and overly long rock songs.
Well, first of all, heavy metal, back when it first started, meant 20-minute guitar solos, half-hour drum solos, songs that went on in epic proportions. I know for a fact that when I see some of the bigger bands and the drum solo happens, I'm drumming. If it goes on for more than 5-10 minutes, when it reaches into 20 minutes, I'll be out there. I'm going to be the first to get out and get a hot dog. And then I'll come back and I probably won't miss a thing.
We'll check in a few albums and see how they're doing. Moving ahead to 1982, there was yet another album, Diver Down, and a new drum set that took yet another step into madness. He now had 6 kick drums on the Hide Your Sheep tour, and they featured lots and lots of tubing. To me, this was the strangest drum set he ever created. Here's a quote from him. In '82, I wanted to try something different. So what we did was take different lengths of tube, which projected each from the kick drum. Each different length would accentuate different frequencies, and we would isolate the ones that we liked and pump those out front. We also mic'd the batter head of the kick drums, so there would be a balance between what comes out the front of the kick drum and the actual impact of the pedal hitting the head. I put a little pad of leather on it so it gets the same attack, you don't lose any punch, and the heads don't break. The front 2 kick drums were actually doubled kick drums of different shell sizes. He decided to go back towards wooden shells instead of plastic, and using Paiste cymbals from the 2002 series and the Rude series. And this tour was the first time we saw any electronics on his live drum set. It featured 3 Simmons pads up near the floor toms. This was all powered by Simmons SDS5 drum brain for the sounds. As far as I can tell, there's no obvious use of electronics in the Diver Down album, so the use of Simmons pads must have been a live show thing in 1982. Alex was using the most cutting-edge electronic drum system available in the early 1980s. So at this point, Van Halen had a yearly rhythm going. They would tour for 10 months of the year, and then create a record in the remaining 2 months. But that wasn't the case in '83. They were still playing off the previous Diver Down album. But just because there wasn't a new album, that didn't stop Alex from experimenting with another crazy drum set. No kick drum was safe from this guy. Here's a quote from Alex. For this drum set, we're putting some radial horns in the front of the bass drums, just to punch a little more highs out in the stage area in the front. The batter head would be mic'd, and the front would be mic'd, and we'd get a balance out of that. That way, it would almost be like a pre-mix. There will be a mix that goes into the thing before the sound man out front have a chance to accentuate the proper frequencies because all halls are different. This year, I changed to power toms, the longer ones. They just seem to have a little bit more resonance and depth if you tune them just a little bit higher than the drum actually should be tuned. You get a cross between a regular tom and a deeper sounding one. So now it's time to talk about 1984. This was a huge year for the band. They created some of their most popular songs ever on this album. The first configuration had 5 rototoms up front and center. He also had some of the kick drums joined together with this accordion-like contraption too. And his snare drum used an ungodly amount of gaff tape to dampen the sound. By the time the tour hit, the drum set had changed. The rototoms were pretty much out, and 7-tama octobonds were in. Alex decided that what he really needed was a fully bedazzled drum set. We also saw Alex using what I believe was a fairly new series from Paiste at this time, which was the Rude cymbals. Of course, in addition to his 2002s. That was his primary cymbal setup for his entire life. The Drum History podcast just did a great series on Paiste that I highly recommend if you'd like to learn more about this era. But in reality, all those acoustic elements were just window dressing for what actually made the sound. The Simmons equipment. The cymbals and the snare were acoustic, of course, but the toms were all Simmons, just hidden from view. The kick drum sound really stands out because it was also electronic. They glued plywood strips inside the kick drums and wired sensors into them, which then connected to a Simmons STS5 drum brain. This means the primary kick drum shells were basically just for show. This gave the 1984 album a sound and feel which was very different from anything Alex had recorded before. And according to an interview with Eddie, it almost looks like choosing electronic drums were just an accident due to space constraints. The band was recording in a small home studio, and it just wasn't big enough to fit a giant Alex Van Halen drum set. But going with Simmons allowed them to create some interesting sounds, like the intro for Hot for Teacher. And by the way, if you want to see this drum set in person, there's a good chunk of it on the wall of the Hard Rock Cafe in Tampa, Florida. Just ironically without a lot of the pads that made the actual sounds of the album. Next up was the 5150 album, which was a pretty big change. The lead singer, David, was out, and Sammy was in.
Van Halen show is always a lot of improvisation, especially with Sammy. I never know where he's going to be, what he's going to do. He runs up in the truss 50 feet in the air, and I can't even see him.
The entire album was basically a Simmons drum set with Paiste cymbals and a 6.5x14 rosewood snare. But of course, as drummers know, the studio drum set and the live drum set don't always match. The basic mentality he had throughout his entire career was that people paid to see a show, and the cosmetics of the drum set were a big part of that. On the acoustic side of things, the drums were pretty much the same as the 1984 setup, but with a different look to the shells. And everything was sitting on this huge drum riser that looked awesome, but it had a lot of problems.
Well, it goes 18 feet in the air, 16 feet wide. It spins 360 degrees, weighs 5,280 pounds, and it hurts when it rolls over your little foot.
Here's what Alex had to say about it. So yeah, the drum riser goes up. We tried it once going down into the ground, but sometimes it wouldn't come back up. The people that sell you this stuff will tell you it can do everything but the windows. But when it actually comes time for you to try it out, they're like, you mean you're gonna be on it too? Oh, no, this thing is only rated for 500 pounds. You've already got 1,500 pounds on it. So we used this thing on the 5150 tour, where the drums were supposed to be completely hidden from view. The audience saw nothing but the stage. Everything's underground. And then all of a sudden, boom, the stuff comes up out of the ground. Except my drums. I'd say probably 10 times out of 20.
I believe the Simmons pads and equipment he used in 1984 was pretty much carried over to the new album tour. The sound was very popular, so he kept using it. But we have much better behind the drums footage on the 5150 tour to see what the configuration actually looked like.
And by the way, as a quick fun fact, if you really felt like it, you could have bought some of his Simmons equipment a few years back for about 10 grand on this auction. Moving ahead to 1988 came his largest drum set he had ever put together. Again.
For me, the drums are just a logical extension of myself. If I want to hit a certain, or I hear a certain pitch in my mind and a certain sound, then I want to be able to make it. Sometimes it rotates, but it rotates in the wrong direction. I caught myself the other day and I was looking back and I was going, hey, where's the band? Oh, there they are.
Last time I went overboard with, it was really 3 drum sets glued together because the stage rotated and whichever one happened to face forward was the one I played.
The drum set featured 6 kick drums with speakers in them, and this time he didn't double them, so it wasn't 12 kick drums bolted together, it was actually just 6 really long kick drum shells. You can still clearly hear a Simmons pad in a solo that he did on the tour, and then on the album you'll also hear Simmons drum audio about 3 minutes into the song Black and Blue. And also at least one of the kick drums was still triggering sounds from the Simmons STS5 brain.
Alex was now transitioning away from heavy electronic drum integration back to a primarily acoustic setup.
Moving ahead to 1991 through 1993, this drum set was significantly smaller than his previous drum sets. It only had 6 pieces, which then got bumped up to 7 with the introduction of his second kick drum. It turns out Alex just can't stand only using one kick drum for concerts.
I've just
trying to remember what it was I was gonna do in the solo. You know, these little pieces I gotta glue them together.
Now, at this point in his drumming career, the electronic drum integration was being pared down significantly. According to an overhead look via Modern Drummer magazine in 1993, there was just one Simmons pad on the far left of the drum set. E-drums took over the industry in the early 1980s, but that created a bubble that basically burst in the late 1980s. The entire industry fell apart. After a few more years, the band came back with an album called Balance.
And personally, I feel it is the best thing that we've done as far as production-wise and songwriting-wise.
This batch of music and just the place and time emotionally and whatever, where we were at this point in time, and I thought it fit the record.
And the way things work in this band is like the brothers will always agree, so it's always two.
No. He's setting that up.
The best I can do is go to Mike and pay him off, or like really try to get Mike, and then you got a battle. And then the second I leave the room, the brothers get Mike and convince him the other way, and then I come back in the room, and it's 3 against 1, and I never get my way in this band, and I'm sick of it.
There were 2 drum sets that you would see in 1995. One in red and one in green. They were both Ludwig maple drum sets with power toms and mostly Paiste 2002 cymbals. This was around the time that he switched away from using stage monitors over to using in-ears. This seems kind of mundane now, but back then it was really rare. In fact, you couldn't go to a music store and just choose between 5 or 10 different kinds of in-ear brands because they just didn't exist yet. Okay, so now we need to move ahead to 1998.
I can't see any reason for this band to burn out because we don't do anything that would burn us out. Except part 2.
We tried to be gentlemen about this, and I guess we're just going to get a little bit nasty right now.
So out of all this mess steps in a new lead singer, Gary.
Alex Van Halen, Michael Anthony, Gary Cherone, and Eddie Van Halen. This is Van Halen III, the third and final version, as you guys would say. And the minute you got here, Gary, there was an energy, there was a connection.
Every individual person of the band was great, but putting them all together resulted in one of the worst albums I've heard in a really, really long time.
Van Halen does it in 3 minutes. I mean, why take a half an hour when you do it in 3?
Now, aside from the problems the album had, the drum set itself was great. It was very similar to the setup that he had on his balance kit, but now it came in yellow. The toms got shallower, and he added in some yellow congas near the hi-hat. Those patterns on the resonant heads are actually V and H in Hindi.
For the electronics, Alex was using D-drum clip-on triggers. You can see one right here on the second high tom, and possibly elsewhere that we just can't see, like on a kick drum. The company Simmons was basically done for at this point, so Alex turned to the next high-end electronic drum company of the 90s, which was D-drum.
So after all that mess, Van Halen took a few years off. So in 2004, there was a reunion tour. Gary was out, Sammy was in. On the acoustic side of things, this drum set was another Ludwig kit in a natural finish. It was a very large drum set. There were 3 kick drums, 2 snares,
and a bunch of octobans.
2 of the kick drums were massive 26-inch shells. I personally find it very interesting where they put the hi-hat stand on this drum set. It's basically touching kick drum number 1. And as you'd probably guess, he was still using the Paiste 2002 line because that's his favorite cymbal line of all time. And on this kit, he was rocking Iron Cobra kick drum pedals.
Now talking about the electronic drum integration, there are 2 D-drum pads over the floor toms. The octobans also have the guts of some more D-drum pads of the same size, placed inside of them that you can see right here in this photo. And finally, you'll notice 2 D-drum bass triggers over here. I'm guessing they're doubled in case of failure or for sound layering purposes. In 2007, there was another reunion tour, this time with the OG singer David Lee Roth returning. I can only guess at the work that went into fusing these together. No kick drum is safe from Alex. He decided to take another kick drum and turn it into a MIDI fridge for storing beer, I guess, between shows. On this drum set, he didn't have any more D-drum pads over the floor toms and instead put all of his electronics inside of these converted octobans.
And then moving forward to 2012, this was a temporary drum set he used to launch the album called A Different Kind of Truth. The actual tour kit was a return to form, even with joining the forward-facing kick drums just in a slightly different way. There were also a couple of extra bass drums off to the side for reasons. This one didn't even have a kick drum pedal on it, and at this point in his career, his drum set had been locked into a template. The sizes, the cymbal choices, everything was pretty much familiar and wouldn't change that much from now on. And that brings us to the final drum set we're going to be covering, the 2015 setup.
Ludwig classic maple shells with chrome wrap. Everything's got custom copper plated hardware. Kick drums are 26. Rack toms are standard depth. This is 8x12, 9x13. Ludwig Atlas pedals, 8-inch octagon type drums. 12 and 13 timbales over here, and the key to the Alex Van Halen snare drum sound is Alex Van Halen.
Now, their last album, A Different Kind of Truth, was successful and well received, so naturally there was talk about them creating another album. According to Alex, there are hundreds of unfinished songs just sitting in the studio archives.
Filed away.
I'll show you
we've never heard of, you know?
How much?
How much do you think? A lot.
Probably about 100 records worth.
In fact, they had already pulled from that archive to create A Different Kind of Truth. But unfortunately, the new album just never happened. In 2020, tragedy struck as the original bass player, Mark Stone, died of cancer. Only 10 days later, Eddie, who was also fighting cancer, passed away due to a stroke. This made huge waves in the music industry as fans everywhere mourn the loss of one of the greatest guitar players of all time. The DNA of this band was always Alex and Eddie, and you can't have Van Halen without both of them. So this marked the end of the band.
Now, I really hate to end the video like that. So many classic rock bands have been getting older, and we've lost a lot of iconic musicians over the past few years. But I feel like we should be grateful that Alex is still around. With all the crazy things that were happening in the 70s and the 80s, it's a miracle that so many of these musicians are in decent health at all. So that was your breakdown of Alex Van Halen's drum sets over the years. Have an awesome day, and I'll see you all in a few.
Again, it really boils down to, if you enjoy what you're doing, then it wasn't so much an objective that we're trying to reach in terms of where are we going with this. It just happens, sort of.
Depends on what you enter this arena for. You want to be a rock star? Okay, well, rock stars come and go. Musicians make music till the day they drop, you know?